Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Spratt. I work for Sports Info Solutions, and I'm joined, as always, by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, the football gods have blessed us with, I think, a really enjoyable holiday season, and a lot of that stuff is starting this weekend with some games, both Christmas Eve and Christmas, one of which we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I would say it's really amazing. We've had some real clunkers in prime time because of the fact that, they don't flex Thursday and Monday games, but they really lucked out for the holiday weekend. I mean, the Christmas Eve game, Cincinnati and Houston, is not great, but at least it has playoff implications. But Giants at Philadelphia is good, and then the Christmas Day games are fabulous. Baltimore at Pittsburgh, Denver at Kansas City, and then Detroit at Dallas on Monday night. That is three really important good games.
And I want to get started today talking about the Ravens versus Steelers game, because this game is interesting from a variety of reasons. One, because I think we know some new stuff about the Steelers and the Ravens, or have some new perspectives to offer. And two, because obviously the playoff implications of that game are just enormous. Let's start by talking about the teams specifically themselves. Start with the Steelers. I noticed that the Steelers had actually climbed up to number one in weighted DVOA. That kind of snuck up on me a little bit. I know they've won a lot of games recently, but can you talk about how exactly they arrived at that place? I feel like it's been an unusual route for them this season.
Sure. Now, it's a little bit of a fluke, but a little bit not of a fluke. The way that the weights work is based on research I did a few years ago that frankly needs to be updated, looking at what was the best combination of weights to use to predict how teams would do the rest of the season. And the way that it works is that there's a dip in the importance of games that are more than 8 weeks old, and then a bigger dip in the importance of games that are more than 12 weeks old. And what game did Pittsburgh play 13 weeks ago? The game where the Eagles destroyed them. So what happens is that this week, that game suddenly is much less important in that formula, which normally isn't that big a deal, because normally you don't have a team that goes from a really awful game like that to a really amazing game like the one Pittsburgh played the following week against Kansas City in consecutive weeks. But they do in this case. So the Steelers, unless they blow out the Ravens, their weighted DVOA will actually go down next week. It's a little bit of a fluke in the system. That being said, they're also third overall this week, so it's not that much of a fluke for them to be number one. They would still be in the top three regardless.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a weird situation where, on one hand, they've had these like incredible highs and incredible lows throughout the season, and you pointed out in your DVOA article that they've actually had the number one variance in week-to-week DVOA. But on top of that, they've also been a very consistent team in terms of like offense versus defense and that sort of stuff. So it's kind of just a really weird team, I feel like.
It's also been kind of quiet, right?
Yeah.
We're all talking about, Aaron Rodgers, RELAX, they've won all these games in a row. Well, Pittsburgh has won 5 straight games, folks. I believe that's the same as Green Bay's streak, so pay more attention to Pittsburgh, people.
Yeah, and so Pittsburgh, they're now top 10 in both offensive and defensive DVOA. The closest team to them in that respect is the Chiefs, who are 13th and 12th. I mean, the Chiefs are obviously a team that everyone's, realizing is one of the major contenders. It's weird that it's kind of backward this year, where normally everybody's totally understanding how good the Steelers are, but now they just kind of snuck up on us, I guess.
Right. I mean, there's a little bit of a discussion. I think people say, the Steelers, watch out, they'll be dangerous in the playoffs. But they're actually, it's not that they haven't been that good this year and they suddenly could get dangerous in the playoffs. They've actually been one of the best teams in the league this year. It's just, again, year of no great teams.
Right.
So Pittsburgh hasn't been great because nobody has. But in a year of unbalanced teams, they are, oddly enough, the most balanced team, which is weird because that defense, when you look at the personnel on it, does not look like it should be an above-average defense. And I do think there is a legitimate worry for the playoffs that Pittsburgh may not be as good on defense as its numbers look, but also that their offense may be better than the numbers look.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense given their personnel. Now, the Ravens, they're weirder in their own ways, for sure. They actually have one of the bigger disparities between their normal DVOA and their weighted DVOA. By overall, they're 10th, but weighted, they're 5th. And while the Steelers are obviously on the middle of their big winning streak, the Ravens have actually also won 5 of the last 7 games, with their only 2 losses in that stretch coming to the Patriots and Cowboys, both on the road, both of those teams being the top 2 teams in DVOA. So, I mean, the Ravens are quite a hot team themselves coming into this matchup, which makes it pretty interesting. We've talked a lot about their defense, but given their recent play overall, do you think that teams should be considering this team one of the more dangerous teams, maybe of the ilk that Denver was last year entering the playoffs?
Well, I mean, this defense is not what Denver's defense was last year. But look, here's the thing about consistency. Baltimore is 26th in variance. So like Pittsburgh, they've been very inconsistent. And they've been that way for a while because their offense is just tremendously inconsistent and has been for years. The only offense that's been more inconsistent this year is the Rams, mostly because of one game against Detroit.
Sure.
So if you're a good team like New England, Dallas, Pittsburgh, you want to be as consistent as possible so that you're really good every week. If you're a mediocre team that makes it to the playoffs, you want to be as inconsistent as possible because that raises the possibility that you could go on a run, which is what Baltimore did in 2012. And that's what I would be scared of this year if I was playing Baltimore. Honestly, if Flacco comes out and has a game that is equal to the average of how he's performed this year, they will lose. I mean, they may not lose. They may not lose if they're the 5th seed and they go to Houston, but otherwise they'll lose. But if he is on the high side of what Flacco can do, and Mike Wallace doesn't drop balls, like, they could go on a run, and that's what would scare me. But I'd be a lot more scared of Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh just has so much more talent. At every position, they are better than what Baltimore is on offense. I cannot think of a position where Baltimore is better than Pittsburgh on offense, except maybe tight end, and whichever guard position David DeCastro is playing versus whichever guard position Marshall Yanda is playing. If they're not the same position, then Baltimore is better at one of them.
Well, I mean, the chances are most teams won't have to worry about both teams in the playoffs. This game could very well decide which team makes it. And we'll talk about the specific odds of both teams in a minute. But specifically to this matchup, a couple of weeks ago we talked about how the Ravens were the number 1 team in rushing DVOA and historically good against running backs, but how they were subpar against receiving backs. And I was kind of wondering where that left them in terms of defending Le'Veon Bell specifically.
Well, the first thing is that their run defense has not been as good over the last 3 weeks, right? So first Jay Ajayi had like 6 yards of carry, but he didn't carry the ball much. LeGarrette Blount had some success against them, and then last week they gave up a lot of yardage to Ryan Matthews. He ended up number 1 DYAR for the week for running backs because of the fact that he did it against Baltimore. So they've allowed 4.3 yards of carry over the last 3 games. The other thing is that they are not good against receiving backs. They're 25th in DVOA against running backs in the passing game, and that is not a good stat to have against Le'Veon Bell.
That's true. I will say that in their previous matchup in Week 9, they limited Bell to just 70 total yards on 20 total touches, about half of that yardage coming as a receiver, half as a runner. So they were able to hold him in check in that game. And I wonder specifically that might be because of their great tackling ability. One of Bell's great strengths is his ability to break tackles. He's broken 52 on the season. That's the 5th most among all backs, even though he missed a couple of games to start the year. But the Ravens' defense allows the 4th fewest broken tackles. So they're able to wrap up. Perhaps that'll help him, and it did earlier in the season, but maybe something not to count on, given how dangerous Bell is in open space as a receiver. What about
the other things? Go on.
I was just going to say, what about Antonio Brown? There's another player that's incredibly dangerous, but I feel like the Ravens might actually have the personnel to handle him better than most teams, at least.
Well, here's the thing about that, right? So looking at the Sports Info Solutions charting data, Tavon Young, the rookie, and Jimmy Smith are actually both in the top 10 for cornerback success rate. 63% for Tavon Young, Jimmy Smith 60%. But Jimmy Smith is injured. Jimmy Smith has an ankle injury. He's been out for a couple weeks. It looks unlikely that he will play in this game, and that makes it so it's Tavon Young and Sharice Wright, and that's much weaker. And also, in the last game, Brown had 7 catches for 85 yards and a touchdown. The Ravens did not use Smith to follow him around. So, even if even if Smith were healthy, the Steelers would not need to move Brown around, to take advantage. They could move Brown around and take advantage of matchups as they want. So I can't really see the Ravens keeping Antonio Brown down. I just really like the Steelers in this game. I think they're the better team, and I know they're the home team, and I just think that they have a better chance in this game. And I believe in them here, that they're just more talented.
Well, the Steelers are in a little bit better situation too. Beyond even hosting the game, they're 9-5 compared to the Ravens being at 8-6. So they have the 1-game lead right now, which means that if for whatever reason the Steelers lost this game, maybe they're still in the mix. But let's break down all of those specifics. So if the Steelers win this game against the Ravens, they would be 2 games ahead with 1 game to go. So that would mean they would lock up the North with a win, correct?
Correct. Yes, Pittsburgh is in with a win in this game. But if they don't win this game, they're nowhere near out of it. If they don't win this game, they become, the significant favorite for the wild card, right? So if they lose this game, the division race is sort of slightly goes to Baltimore for the last week of the season. It's 56% Baltimore, Pittsburgh 44%. But, they both have tough games in the last week. So, Baltimore has a tough game in the last week. Pittsburgh has an almost assured win.
That's what I was going to say. The Steelers host the Browns, so obviously that's
right. Well, Baltimore has to go to Cincinnati, and Cincinnati may be out of it, but they're still frisky, and that's still a home game for them. But even if Pittsburgh were to lose this game, of course, you do probably pencil in a win against Cleveland, and at that point they're 10-6, and that pretty much makes them the second wild card in the AFC. In fact, the team that needs to be really rooting for Pittsburgh in this game, the teams that really need to root for Pittsburgh are Miami and Denver.
Yeah, for sure. Because the Dolphins are 9-5 right now, but pretty much every other contender has fewer than 9 wins. The Broncos, Texans, and Titans all are 8-6. The Bills and Colts are kind of remote at 7-7. So I mean, if the Steelers lose, the Dolphins are the only team that sort of can control their destiny to that extent, right?
The Dolphins have interesting rooting interests this week. First of all, they need to root for Indianapolis to beat Oakland, because that would mean that the Patriots will likely clinch the number 1 seed and might rest starters against the Dolphins in Week 17. Number 2, they need to root for Pittsburgh to beat Baltimore, because Pittsburgh is a much stronger competitor for a wild card than Baltimore is.
Yeah. So, like, if the Ravens lose this game, are they pretty much out of it, or do they still have a hope in the last week, too?
If the Ravens lose this game, they still have a hope. We would have them at 17% chance to win a wild card at that point. But it would be, at that point, it's Miami 50%, Denver 20%, and Baltimore 17%.
Okay.
And assuming, with the assumption that the second place team in the AFC West gets the first wild card.
Sure. Makes total sense. Well, if you think that's complicated, things are about to get a lot more complicated, because let's shift over and talk about the NFC Wild Card picture.
Please don't make me talk about Carolina and New Orleans and how they can make the playoffs, because I don't even understand it.
Oh, no. I mean, it's totally obvious. The Panthers only need like 5 different crazy things to happen, including a Redskins tie, of course. We'll ignore that. But let's talk about all the other teams that are realistically in this picture. I guess we should first talk briefly about the Giants, because the Giants have more or less completely locked up one of the 2 wildcard spots. If things went incredibly wrong for them to the tune of they're losing both games, and then like Tampa winning out, Detroit winning 1 and losing 1, blah, 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 never mind. It can't really happen.
It happens in 7 out of every 1,000 simulations.
So let's just... exactly. So let's just go ahead and say the Giants have a slot. That still leaves the second wild card open in the NFC, and there are a lot of weird things that can happen here. So let's kind of go through some of the scenarios, Aaron, and get your thoughts on both the teams and then also if their specific games this week might have impacts on that. Let's talk about that. Okay, starting with Detroit, they are currently 1 game ahead of Green Bay, and they play each other in Week 17. So if by whatever small chance it happens that Detroit wins this week in Dallas and Green Bay loses at home against Minnesota, which is probably not too likely at this point, that would clinch the North for Detroit, right?
Right, but otherwise we go into Week 17 with that game being for the division title, although not necessarily, for those of you who are interested in broadcast schedules, not necessarily the game that will be flexed to the night position, because there is a reasonable chance, thanks to Washington losing, there's a reasonable chance that game will not be a win and you're in. It will be a win and you get the division, lose, and you get a wild card, while the Houston Tennessee game is more likely to be win and you're in.
Right. Okay, so specific to these games themselves, I noticed that the Lions are still 31st in defensive DVOA, but they haven't allowed an opponent to score more than 20 points in their last 8 games. I'm wondering is there anything to the fact that the Lions defense has been playing better recently, or is this sort of a thing where the point totals aren't accurately capturing how well their defense has played?
It's really weird. The Detroit's DVOA rating is really weird because I think it's easy to explain why Houston is only 30th despite having a winning record. Everyone looks at that and knows how bad Brock Osweiler's been. But with Detroit, it's a lot harder to explain to people. It's complicated. First of all, I will say Detroit's defense has gotten better in the second half of the season, but not that much better. They've gone from 32nd to 23rd. They were 32nd through week 9, 23rd in weeks 10 through 15. Why do we have Detroit's defense so low in DVOA, even though they're something like 10th in the league in points allowed per game? Well, it's interesting. Here's the thing. The way the Lions are playing this year has led to a very, very slow pace. And that means that they have faced the fewest drives in the league, and they have had the fewest drives in the league. Essentially, the conservative pace makes the offense not look as good as it is, and makes the defense look a lot better than it really is. The next situation is the schedule. They've played the 29th ranked schedule of opposing offenses. So that also makes the defense look better than it really is. The other thing about the Lions is that the special teams, the punting unit with Sam Harris, has been really strong. He's the number 2 punter in the league this year behind Johnny Hekker. So that means that opposing offenses are often have to drive longer in order to score. So that's also helping them keep the points down. And then there's a fourth thing, which is they've only allowed 1 return touchdown. And when we look at points per game, right, that includes defense, scores teams, yep, on the offense by opposing defenses or special teams, but of course that has nothing to do with defense.
Right, but I think all of this is basically a way to say that things are boding a little bit poorly for them in trying to deal with the Cowboys.
Oh, the Cowboys are a much better team, yeah. And of course it's in Dallas.
Right, so is Detroit's run defense worse or better than their pass defense?
It's better. They're 20th in run defense and 30th in pass defense.
Okay, that might be a little bit in their favor then for this matchup, but obviously still the Cowboys' offense, very difficult to stop regardless.
I don't think Ezekiel Elliott is scared by the number 20 run defense in the league.
Probably not. I doubt he's scared by very much at all. This is kind of a long tangent getting to the point that all of a sudden Detroit, who I think a couple of weeks ago I would have just assumed was the North winner, they could now be like a very relevant wildcard team because they could lose to the Cowboys here, lose to Green Bay next week, and then all of a sudden be stuck, with 9 wins for the season. Like if that does happen, like where does that stack them up compared to the other wild card contenders?
Oh, you mean if they lose this week, where's their percentage chance for a wild card?
Yeah, so lose this week or win this week, because even if they win this week and then lose next week, they would still lose the tiebreaker in the North to Green Bay, right?
If they lose this week, they still win a wild card in 22% of simulations. If they win this week, they still win a wild card in 34% of simulations.
Okay.
And obviously, they'd be more likely to win a wild card if they win this week and then lose to Green Bay. Either way, look, I mean, unless they beat the Cowboys and Green Bay loses, again, otherwise that last game is for the North title.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine them likely to beat the Cowboys, but, they can. They certainly could. But I think it's more likely that they lose this game, which means both teams are probably tied going into that last game. And, I mean, there's a good chance the loser of that last game gets a wild card.
So what is there any way for Green Bay to end up with a wild card in this scenario? Or, so they would have to then lose next week so they don't win the North. But if they won this week but then lost next week, would they have a chance at the wild card?
Yes. They have a wild card in 15% of simulations where they win this week. The thing is that they don't have a lot of tiebreakers at 9 and 7. So they would really need for Washington to lose twice.
Right. Okay. And then another team that's sort of in this mix the whole way is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. they're playing the Saints in New Orleans this week, and then I think close at home against the Panthers. Do they need to win out to have a realistic chance, or like where do they stand in all of this?
I don't think the Bucs need to win out. I think if they go 1-1, it just depends a lot on what happens around them. So, like I said, there's the issue of tiebreakers because. So I'm looking right now at the conference records, but Tampa Bay and Green Bay, they would have the same conference record if they both go 1-1. But I think there's another tiebreaker then where Tampa would beat Green Bay. Don't quote me on this. Tampa Bay, I mean, listen, there's a good chance they could win both games. There's a good chance that they could lose both games. I think the most likely thing is that they go 1-1 and Atlanta goes 1-1 in the last couple games. But if Tampa Bay wins this week in New Orleans, their playoff odds go up to 80%, because in that case they win the division almost half the time and then a wild card like 35% of the time. If they lose this week, their playoff odds drop to 18%. But at that point, they still win the division 10% of the time and a wild card 8% of the time. And some of that is that Week 17's game is tough for them, too, because Carolina is looking a lot better than they were a few weeks ago. It's sort of interesting. Atlanta and Tampa play the same two teams in the last 2 weeks, just opposite of each other.
Yeah. So speaking specifically about the Tampa game in New Orleans this weekend, they played each other 2 weeks ago, and in that game, the Bucs held Drew Brees and the Saints to just 11 points. Kind of a strange game, but I was wondering whether there might have been something that you noticed that you might think of as being predictive for this game.
You know, while matchups are really important in football, I also think that a single game does not necessarily presage what will be in the rematch. The best example of that always is the New England Patriots beating the Jets by like 45-3 in 2010 and then losing to them in the playoffs 4 weeks later.
Yeah.
So I think it's better to look at what the Bucs and Saints have done over the course of the entire season, and the fact is that over the course of the whole season, the Saints' offense has been a lot better than that. And the Bucs' defense, you know, we've talked about how it's been better in the last few weeks, but it wasn't against Dallas last week.
Right.
And this game is in New Orleans, and I don't think Drew Brees is going to throw 3 interceptions again.
I think that's probably all fair. So I think that leaves the last team to really talk about here as the Redskins. And there may not be much else to say about them because by losing to the Panthers on Monday night, that really hurt their playoff odds, right? Bad for you. It was bad. So I think according to your ESPN playoff odds article, they've fallen from 49.6% chance to make the playoffs, so basically 50-50, down to 20.8%. So that's pretty huge, and at this point they would basically need to win out and then get help from a couple of other teams too, which is not impossible.
If they lose at Chicago this week, they're pretty much cooked. The odds drop to less than 1%.
Yeah. So, man, I feel like there's a lot in play in the NFC, and I think all of this is basically leading to Week 17 this year. We're going to have some really compelling games. Already talked about, the Detroit-Green Bay game. We may actually have to talk a little bit about the AFC South for a change next week if, like, the Titans and Texans are playing for a division title. But so this is all really great for the fan, but it's kind of tricky to sort it all out. I'm very impressed you could keep it straight with me there.
Washington's loss really hurt NBC. Because I know they would much rather have Green Bay-Detroit as the primetime game. But there's a good chance they're going to have to schedule Green Bay-Detroit and all the NFC Wild Card possibilities to all play at the same time. They're going to have Atlanta and Tampa Bay and Green Bay-Detroit and Washington all playing at the same time so none of them can influence the others based on who wins or loses.
Right.
And then they would put Houston, Tennessee at 8 p.m.
I love that because I love to watch multiple games at the same time and just seeing all of that happening at once. Sounds really fun.
Well, NBC doesn't love that.
I know.
They are really dying to advertise Matthew Stafford and Aaron Rodgers rather than some college fans who still like Marcus Mariota and some guy named Savage.
Sign me up. So maybe I'm not the average fan, Aaron, but I'll take it.
How do we advertise the Houston Texans without J.J. Watt? We don't know what to do with ourselves.
It's a tricky marketing situation. There's no doubt about it. Aaron, I think we kind of covered a lot today in a small amount of time. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about before, I think we take our holiday leave?
No, I mean, most of the other stuff is pretty set at this point. We didn't really talk much Dolphins, but, the Dolphins, it's sort of an interesting thing where they hold their own playoff chances in their own hands, but they're also using a backup quarterback. And let us not assume that the ability to tear apart the Jets' pass defense this year is a sign that Matt Moore is really good. And so, therefore, their odds of being in the playoffs are not as strong as they would be otherwise. But there's still a pretty good chance that they're going to end up being the second wild card in the AFC, especially if Pittsburgh does beat Baltimore.
Yeah, former Panther legend Matt Moore, I'll just point out. I'm a huge fan. Okay, well, great, Aaron. I think that was a great show. We've got a lot of great football to look forward to this week and next week. Just to let you know, I'm going to be off on holiday next week, but Aaron's the hardest working man in show business, so he's going to be on recording a podcast with my coworker Greg, who's hosted a few of these before. So look for another episode next week of the Off the Charts Football Podcast, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes and everywhere else you get podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. Enjoy your holidays, everyone.